Hello everyone, today I will be showcasing 10 cars that suffer from power creep heavily in GTA Online. Just in case you didn't know, power creep basically just means a car that fell out of favor due to a newer, better, faster car being released, making the older car obsolete. However, this does not make a car bad because some of these cars can still be fun to drive around. It just means that there is a car better than it's out there. So let's just get into it. First up, we have the Krieger. Now, this specific car mainly only applies for next-gen consoles, so Xbox Series X, S, PlayStation 5, not the older generation consoles or PC. Because the Krieger is still a very good car on older gen consoles, because on older gen there is no HSW, and that basically means that the Krieger has no higher competition to compete with, because before HSW, the Krieger was still a pretty good car. It was pretty much top of its class for speed. It wasn't the best handler, but its speed made up for a lot of its capabilities on the track, and it is still a very good car if you are on old gen consoles. It's also not too expensive, which is an added bonus, but on new generation consoles where HSW is present, pretty much every HSW supercar that has been added to the game is better than the Krieger because they are just faster. And most tracks prioritize speed over handling, although some tracks here and there will prioritize handling, and you will want to use a better suited car for that track. But overall, I would say right now the meta pretty much definitely favors cars that are faster, because even if you have to take the turn slower than a car with better handling, you will catch up to them with the HSW. HSW cars have insane acceleration. You will catch up to them by the time they hit their cap, and you will beat them. It's a sad story for the Krieger. I still love the Krieger. I drive it all the time. And once again, if you're on the old generation consoles, still drive the Krieger, because the Krieger is a good car, and this only applies to new generation consoles where HSW is a thing. Next up, we have the 811. The 811 unfortunately fell out of favor pretty quickly because it's pretty much a one-trick pony. All it does is go pretty fast on straights. Its handling is pretty bad. Its braking is insanely bad for its class. The only thing the 811 ever did good was go fast in a straight line, but if there were even any slight turn, the 811 would get lapped by any other car. Basically, the 811 is a pretty bad supercar. Even before HSW was added, I would say it was a pretty low-ranking supercar simply because it didn't have very good handling and it was very hard to drive on most tracks. Funnily enough, the Krieger, I would say, is actually a better car than the 811. It's a better all-around car because it has better handling. Its speed is slightly slower, I believe, but only ever so slightly, and its handling is much better. You will make up for it in the corners and every turn that comes up. But the Krieger is also more expensive than the 811, so keep that in mind as well. So for this one, even if you are on last generation consoles, I would still use any other car besides the 811, honestly. Unless it is an insanely, like if it's an oval track, like NASCAR style, then use the 811 because you will likely do pretty well, because the 811 has a pretty high top speed and a pretty good speed in general. But if it has any remotely slight turns, just don't do it. Use a different car. You will thank me later. The 811 is a straight line car. It is not a handler whatsoever, but it is cheap and I still have it in my collection. Next up is the Pariah. Now, this one is more again for my new generation console people as well. There have been tons of sports cars with HSW that have been added, and even before that, the Pariah honestly had some pretty good competition. The Italy RSX and the Italy GTAO gave us some pretty good competition, even though I believe they are both slightly slower than it. I may be wrong on that. Please correct me in the comments if I am. They had pretty good handling and were overall pretty good sports cars. Even this is all not to mention HSW. HSW blows the Pariah out of the water. It completely demolishes the Pariah. The S95 alone completely solos the Pariah. The Pariah stands no grounds against the S95. It's just a more superior vehicle. It has better handling. It has a higher top speed, has a higher acceleration. It is just a better car all around than the Pariah. But even if you are on last generation consoles, it's not like the Pariah is the one-all be-all sports car. There, once again, is still the Italy RSX, the Italy GTO, and there are other sports cars that people like using, but those were my two personal favorites. I honestly never used the Pariah. The Pariah doesn't have insanely good acceleration, but it does have pretty good top speed. It's basically like the 811 of the sports cars class. It is cheaper than the competition, however, and in my opinion, it does look pretty good, but I also think the competition looks a little bit better, so keep that in mind. That one is just personal preference, but once again, if you are in last generation, don't think that the Pariah is the only sports car you should use. There are other sports cars, especially for particular track styles, that you can use that will put up some good competition against the Pariah. Next up, we have the Amorous. Now, the Amorous is basically the 811 but switched around. It has pretty bad top speed and speed in general, but it is an absolute track demon. This thing has probably the best, this is probably the best handling supercar in the game. It is an insanely good handler, but what severely handicaps it is its speed. You should really only use the Pariah on tracks that are insanely turn heavy, because that's the only time you're going to get value out of this car. If there are some turns but not too many, I would use the Krieger instead, because you will end up being the Amorous in the straight lines. The turns will handicap you a little bit, but you'll beat the Amorous no problem. But yeah, honestly, I would say the Krieger and the Ignis probably are better picks than the Amorous on most tracks, because the Amorous is just not that fast of a car to make up for its great handling. But don't get me wrong, this thing is an insanely fun car to drive when it's not raining. And overall, I would say no matter what generation console you are on, I would say buy the Amorous, because it looks good, it has great customization, it looks pretty close to the McLaren Senna, not too close, but close enough. And it's not too expensive. There are supercars that are more expensive than it that perform worse. So, I mean, that sounds like a fair deal to me. Next up, we have the Duco Death. Now, newer players might not know this, but when the Duco Death was added as part of next generation consoles, that would be Xbox One, PlayStation 4, the original next generation consoles, the Duco Death was actually pretty good. It was cheap, even free for some players, and back then there weren't as many options to choose from in terms of armored cars. It took a couple missiles to kill it. It had some bulletproofing panels, so you were kind of immune to bullets to some degree. A AP pistol or armor piercing rounds would easily kill you. And now that the railgun is in the game, you would get absolutely smoked in this thing. I would not drive this in a modern GTA Online lobby, but back when it was released, it was a pretty good car. However, with the presence of the armored Kuruma, the Insurgent, the Night Shark, pretty much any other weaponized car, this thing fell behind pretty quickly because it's rather slow. It does have pretty good pushing power. It does have a pretty good ram that you can smash through cars with. But it does slow you down quite a bit, and once again, you can only take a couple of missiles before this thing blows up, and it does not have too much bulletproofing panels. While it does have some, it doesn't 100% protect you. But honestly, for the release price of a couple $100,000, even free for some players, I got mine for free. This is not a bad car for new players, but if you are a older player, you have the Night Shark, you have the Insurgent, I wouldn't personally bother with this thing unless you have a collection or something of weaponized cars like I do. Then you could go ahead and collect it, but in modern GTA Online lobbies, this has just fallen far behind. Next up, we have the pre-HSW Deveste 8. Now, I said specifically pre-HSW Deveste 8 because that is what I mean. With HSW on the Deveste 8 now, it is an insanely good car. It is one of the best cars for sure in modern GTA Online on next generation consoles. But before that, it wasn't really that good. Now, some people may argue and say, look, it was a pretty decent car, and I get that. But the Krieger, the 811, now the Ignis, they're all better picks than the Deveste 8 because they have better properties than it. And the Deveste 8 also is a pretty long car, so whenever you go into a corner, you have to compensate for the length of the car because it's so long. So you have to enter the corners slightly. It takes you longer to enter a corner basically because you have to wait for the tail end of your car to clear the corner. While as on the Krieger per se, you don't have to take that precautionary measure because it's not that long and you can take the corner faster and more efficiently. But also the Deveste 8 was never particularly that fast. If you were on a track that had the ability to have a Deveste 8 on it, you should probably just use the 811 because it is slightly better than the Deveste 8 on those tracks. But the Deveste 8 is a pretty crazy looking car, and that's why I personally have it. The Zentorno. Back when the Zentorno came out as part of the High Life update back in 2013, I believe, if not 2014, it was a pretty good car because you see these panels on the back. Well, this panel on the back, it is completely bulletproof. Basically, you cannot shoot through it, and that was insanely good because people would troll by using this. Basically, they would just reverse into you, have a sticky bomb hanging out the window, throw it at you, and you couldn't do nothing about it because back then most people were low levels. They did not have a grenade launcher, they did not have an RPG, they didn't have nothing, so they can't really do anything against the Zentorno. Honorable mention here also goes to the Jester because the Jester also had a similar panel on the back of it that allowed you to do pretty much the same thing for a quarter of the price basically. But the Zentorno did perform better, and I actually believe the Jester is in the sports class and not the super class, so they wouldn't even compete on the same track. Even if they did, regardless, the Zentorno would still beat the Jester because the Jester is a pretty slow car. It's not that good, and in my opinion, the Zentorno looks better. But as more and more supercars started to get added, the Zentorno very rapidly fell behind because it was never a really good car. It was mainly useful in free mode for that reason I just described, throwing the sticky bombs out and being unable to shoot the driver. Don't get me wrong, it was still competitive in races, but as more and more cars came out, once again, it just fell behind, and this is a classic case of power creep. The Toros. Now this one is kind of specific to next gen. I say kind of because On old gen, the Toros is a pretty good SUV, but it's kind of like the 811 once again. It has a very high top speed and pretty good acceleration, but the handling is just terrible on this thing. It's really wonky and unstable. Whenever you hit a bump in this thing, the car feels like it wants to go crazy. It does not feel planted at all, and once again, unless you're on a track that is very straight and you're racing in the SUVs category for some reason, you might want to choose a different option because the Toros just ain't it. Next gen, with the addition of the Astron Custom and HSW, the Astron Custom completely blows this thing out the water. It's more stable. I think it is slightly slower acceleration, but you make up for it in terms of top speed and stability. Whenever you go into a turn, you could tell it just feels more planted than the Toros ever did. But I think it's also important to mention that the Astron Custom with HSW mods cost probably 3 times what the Toros cost, so keep that in mind as well. But for what it is, the Toros is just not that good. It fell out of favor pretty quickly for most people, even though some people swear by it. They will use it in SUV races. The one SUV race that they do a year. But me personally, especially on next gen, I will be using the Astron Custom with HSW because it just makes more sense. It's more stable, it's faster, and I just like driving it more. But the price makes up a lot for the Toros. Next up, we have the Insurgent. The Insurgent has a similar story to the Duco Death. Instead of falling out of favor to the Insurgent and the Night Shark, the Insurgent fell out of favor not to itself, but the Night Shark. The Night Shark does everything better. It's faster, it takes more RPGs, it's just better all around, and it's just more mobile and more flexible. You can go into some alleys or whatever with it. You cannot go into much alleys with the Insurgent. The Insurgent is basically like driving a bus around the city. It's not very fun for you or the person chasing you, and it is just an absolute dog in terms of speed. It is incredibly slow, but it is about half of the price of the Night Shark. So if you don't have the Night Shark, you're a new player to GTA Online, I will say that the Insurgent is still a good pick for you because the Night Shark is double. Even though I would tell you, honestly, just stretch for the Night Shark. No one should really have the Insurgent, but if you want it, it's your money, you can do what you want. But before the Night Shark was in GTA Online, the Insurgent definitely was the superior car to drive around. It took a lot of missiles. There was no oppressor back then as part of the heist update, so you didn't have to deal with flying broomsticks in the air, which is absolutely lovely. Not for a while longer until you got to the gun running update. And once again, back then the Insurgent was very good. It stood its ground very well. But unfortunately, it's kind of like a grandfather. You know, you just see him sitting in the corner and newer, fresh things come by and it just fell out of favor. Once again, another classic case of power creep. The Oppressor Mark II. Everyone's favorite broomstick is on this list, and you may be surprised by this. I will say the Oppressor Mark II has fallen rapidly out of favor, mainly because of the nerfs that Rockstar brought to it. First of all, they increased the price, which is definitely a nerf, makes it less available to new players. And honestly, newer players were the only people using the Oppressor Mark II because they kind of suck and they probably haven't been playing GTA Online for a very long time. So they're like, oh, okay, all I do is press LB on Xbox. I don't know what button it is on other consoles, and I blow up someone for free. Let's go. But that only gets you so far. There's a ton of counters to the Oppressor now. Pretty much every car in the game, basically, most of the cars that people drive around has a missile jammer on it from Imani-Tech. So the Oppressor Mark II doesn't get much use out of that. And actually, mechanically gifted players will just use the Raiju or something because they probably have more money, and the Raiju is just better than the Oppressor Mark II in every way. It's faster, it's more mobile, and it is permanently off the radar. However, the Oppressor Mark II will always have a spot on the ladder for some of the best cars in GTA Online, some of the best vehicles, because it is relatively cheap. I mean, it's hard to say that now because the inflation and Rockstar increasing the price, and it being overall harder to make money now due to the KO Pericle nerfs. Don't even get me started on that right now. The Oppressor Mark II is just less available. It is bad, it is expensive, and this is basically why it fell out of favor. And the cars that don't have Imani-Tech on them have a ton of armor or something, and that is basically why the Oppressor Mark II fell out of favor. I'm not even sad that this happened to the Mark II because I hate it, and I know you probably hate it as well. And that is it, everyone. 10 cars that suffered from power creep in GTA Online. Power creep is something that is inevitable with gaming. Newer, better things will always come out, replacing the older, worse things. But as the players, I think it's important to respect both. Respect the new things that are coming out because you're respecting new development, but respect the old things because you are respecting the older developments. And I especially agree with that in GTA Online. Thank you all for watching so much. Have a great day, and goodbye.